welcome to the Wildline Podcast. I'm your host, Dan. This is a podcast about movies and how much money they make at the box office. Today will be the weekend review show for August 9th through the 11th, 2019. We have tons of new wide releases. It's insane. There's like 7 or something. So what we're going to do is walk through the top 10 of the box office, do a deeper dive in this new wide releases. And then we have the debut of a new segment on the show. My good friend Chris, we've been friends from high school. We used to do a podcast together called the Hot Song Podcast a few years back, which was a lot of fun. He's going to debut a new segment for the podcast called the Time Machine, where he's going to walk through the box office from 20, 25 years ago and see what was big back then and take a look to the future and see what's coming out next year to try and see how they're going to do at the box office. So I'm really excited to have his new segment on the show, and that'll come right after the top 10. But let's dive in the top 10 and see what happened this weekend. Number 1 this weekend in its second weekend was Fast and the Furious Presents Hobbs and Shaw with $25.4 million, a pretty high 58% drop though. I think that's higher than you would want here. Deadline calls out Mission Impossible, the one from last year, whatever the hell it was called, Fallout maybe? I don't even know. It was a good movie. Had low drops, and everybody's been comparing this movie to that movie because they opened around the same time, blah, 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 blah. That one had a 45% drop. This one has a 58% drop. So right there, the comparison is sort of starting to split. Hobbs and Shaw is going to have a lower multiplier. Mission Impossible had very good legs for that type of movie. I do not think Hobbs and Shaw will with this drop. It's a little bit of a disappointment, I think, for Universal in terms of this thing not popping off as much as they certainly had hoped and maybe even expected. Right now in its second weekend, it sits at $108 million domestically. But like I said last weekend, does it even matter what it does in the US and Canada? This is a global franchise. And when I say global, the US and Canada kind of are low on the totem pole of importance here. Like, they are not the markets where this movie is going to pop off. It's made $333 million worldwide so far. 67% of that coming from foreign markets. That percentage is only going to increase with time. So this is not necessarily, this is one of those movies where, like, I talk about domestic box office and it's certainly interesting, but it really is the global box office that's going to make or break this type of film, and all the Fast and the Furious films for that matter. And so I think the last one had like an 18% domestic take. It was just like insane. But it just goes to show you that, like, the box office is changing a lot, and there's certain properties that are especially more suited towards foreign markets as opposed to the US and Canada, and this is probably one of them to some degree. $200 million production budget, way too high, absolutely way too high. Marketing budget, I think I talked about last week, was like off the charts. Like, I don't even know what it was. I have to look it up, like 160 or something. It doesn't make any sense. Like, the problem here with this movie is, sure, it might be able to make up a lot of cash internationally, but the fact that it's not popping off domestically means that there's maybe a slight miscalculation on how big they thought this was going to be. I thought it was going to be much bigger. I thought it was going to open at 80 and be well into the the 140 range right now, 150 range in terms of its domestic box office. That's clearly not happening. And I think it's, I don't know, I think it's just like kind of a missed note, or it's just a little bit off. It's PG-13, it's action. You have two of the biggest, at least one of the biggest action stars in the world, maybe one of the last A-list action stars or movie stars in the world, Dwayne Johnson. Jason Statham, whatever. He's kind of a guy, everybody knows him. Idris Elba. I mean, you get like the whole crew here, and I don't know. I felt like this is a little bit of a, I don't know if I call it a missed opportunity, because they did seem to like throw, obviously, tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars almost on marketing. What was the misconnection here? Like, where did this thing not pop off, and why didn't that happen? I think ultimately the trailers weren't very good. The marketing, despite there being tons of it, it didn't really seem anything more than like, hey, these are the characters from Fast and the Furious, and they're in their own movie, and that's it. And there's no other sort of like, you need to hook people in. And this is the thing I keep coming back to in this podcast over and over again. As much as IP and like, oh, you're basing a movie on a book, or you're basing a movie on a comic book, or a TV show or whatever. If you have that IP, yes, you have a head start. But at the end of the day, you have to get people to show up. And the only way you're going to do that is by hooking them in through some sort of spectacle or gimmick or just really interesting take on a story or a topic or whatever. You have to really engage people in a very deep way to get them to show up to the movie theater. And that did not happen with Hobbs and Shaw. It just seemed like, hey, this looks like a fun action movie. It's an offshoot of Fast and the Furious. That's cool, and nothing more. In a lot of ways, they're kind of lucky, that it is making the money that it is, because they're kind of riding on the coattails of the Fast and the Furious series and the love for that series. If they didn't have that, and this was just a random action movie with Dwayne Johnson and Jason Statham, maybe it opens to like $30 million, $40 million. Like, it makes half of this amount of money. So they're kind of, I don't know. I think Universal was kind of lazy with this, and I think that's why, despite the fact that like it's performing pretty well within the context of its marketing and production budget, it's not doing all that great. And this 58% drop in this weekend is just not good enough. So we'll see how this plays out over the next couple of weeks, because it's getting really crowded now, which is surprising for August, because like I feel like last August was a really strong August. Crazy Rich Asians and the Meg did really breakout successes that month, and the year before was that sort of barren desert, the August of 2017. What did I call it? The box office crash of 2017. Great episode if you want to go to the archives. This is not that. Like, this is just like throw everything against the wall, see what's going to stick this next couple of weekends. And sometimes it works. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is number 2 this weekend, 20.8 million. That's not bad for this. Only in 3,100 theaters. Per theater average was $6,600 essentially. This one's a little bit surprising for a lot of reasons. One, it's from CBS Films. CBS Films is not going to exist in about a couple of months. The last film they're putting out is in October. This is the second last film they're ever going to put out. So it's kind of it's technically distributed by Lionsgate, but CBS Films is the one who actually produced it. So it's kind of the swan song to a studio that's going to get, I think, sort of melded into, I guess, CBS Entertainment or something. And they're going to focus on streaming, of course, because everything's going to become streaming in the next couple of years. So it's just a weird situation. They throw it out in the gutter slot in August here, where it's just sort of sink or swim. A lot of people are on vacation. Colleges are going back to school. A lot of high schools and grade schools are going back to school earlier and earlier. So it's a kind of a tough spot. And the fact that it somehow got to 20 million is very impressive to me. Now, here's the thing. It does have that built-in audience with the book series. I grew up with those books. They're some of my favorite books growing up. I checked them out of the library constantly at Brookfield Elementary in Wisconsin. And I was that weird kid who would like check these out like once a week, and the librarian's like, "Are you okay?" Because the books are very macabre, especially for younger people. I guess you could do something like this today, but it just almost feels like you couldn't get away with it. Those types of books. So you did have that built-in sort of audience that's like my age, mid to late 30s and under, who grew up with the books and knows them really well. But the movie turned out to actually be pretty good. Based on the trailers, it looked terrible, but critics liked it. 80% Rotten Tomatoes, 65% overall score. Discrepancy there. They liked it, but they didn't really like it all that much. But that's a win. For a horror movie, 80% on Rotten Tomatoes is like a freaking grand slam. Verified audience score is lower, though. 71% verified on Rotten Tomatoes. That's troubling. And that corresponds to the cinema score of a C, which is not good. And also the post-track survey of a 60% out of 100. So you have a discrepancy, right? You have critics like it, but don't love it. Audiences are a little bit more muted. They certainly don't love it. And they're kind of like a meh to it. It kind of seems like cinema score of C is really bad. And verified audience score floating in the low 70s is also not good at all. Again, we are seeing some correspondence with that. I got to do a study on that and post it somewhere. All audience score on Rotten Tomatoes for Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, 70%, 75 out of 100. Corresponds with the verified audience pretty well. 53% definite recommend on post-track, not so great. Letterboxd score of a 60 out of 100. Comparing that to other similar films, and I looked at like anything that was a horror movie that wasn't R, essentially. So Quiet Place, 76 out of 100. That's a really strong score on Letterboxd, so this is nowhere near that. Split had a 70. I think that's way too high. I think I've talked about this before. Why is Split so high on Letterboxd? Why do film nerds like that movie so much? It's not a good movie. It's an absolute shit show. It's a fun shit show, don't get me wrong. It's very enjoyable, but it's not a good film. Goosebumps 58%, Goosebumps 2 50%. So it's higher than those Goosebumps films, but it's kind of just not quality wise. Audiences are definitely not overly ecstatic about it. So what's that going to do? It's going to hurt legs. We also have everything's, the last couple of weeks in August get really slow. So despite the fact that it has opened at 20, I don't think it's going to have good legs. I think it's going to get to maybe 45 domestic, I would say. I think it's going to fall off pretty rapidly here. But it's a good opening weekend, and they should be happy about that. I think it's the second or biggest, pretty close to the biggest opening weekend for CBS films of all time. They were always a really weird studio. I remember looking them up last year on a show, and I was like, I don't get this. I went through their entire release history. I was like, this doesn't make any sense what's going on here. It just seemed like kind of maybe a vanity project for an executive, or just this weird sub-department of a sub-department within CBS. It just didn't add up why they were releasing films theatrically, because they couldn't do anything really well with it. I mean, they were terrible films to release, and none of them were very successful. And $20 million is your second best or best opening of all time. I mean, that's ridiculous. In any event, I think it's going to do okay here. It only cost $20 million. I think $28 million was the production budget. $20 million plus was marketing. So they did spend some cash on this to get it out the door. But I think they're going to be happy. I think it's a win. It's the best you could possibly expect out of a film like this. It wasn't going to hit 30 or 40, I don't think. So 20 is pretty good. They really wanted to avoid the low teens or below. I wouldn't have gone below low teens, but the worst case scenario I think would have been 11, 12. And it's clearly way past that. So I think it's a good performance overall for Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. But I do not think the multiplier is going to be great. Let's keep the train rolling because we have a lot of new wide releases to talk about. The Lion King was number 3 this weekend, $20 million in its fourth weekend, 48% drop. That's a decent drop. $473 million overall right now. We'll note the Letterboxd score on Lion King is at 60 right now, which is not good. But it doesn't matter. $1.3 billion worldwide. This was a cash grab, and it was a pretty pathetic cash grab by Disney. I think a lot of people realize that. I think general audiences realize that. And when general audiences sort of catch on that you're just sort of kind of exploiting them on some level, they get kind of pissed. And it doesn't always happen. They get exploited all the time. They don't realize it. But in a situation like this, there was no reason to make this movie. Everybody knows that. Critics just ravaged the film because it's terrible and there's no point to it. Audiences, they love it on some level, but it's weird. I gotta look at the Rotten Tomatoes score on this. I don't know why I'm going to fucking Lion King rant here or sidetrack. 53% Rotten Tomatoes, whatever. The same thing happened with Aladdin. 88% audience score verified. There's just this weird, here's what's going to happen with this movie. And I got to say this pretty quickly because we got a lot to talk about. But critics, and I would call it the film vanguard, to use a Marxist term, they are against this movie in a very strong way, almost militantly against it, for a lot of reasons. I think because, one, they realized creatively there's no reason to make this. Two, it was basically a corporate decision to make a lot of money. It has nothing to do with art. And 3, I think ultimately it's just not a good film. If those first 2 were right and it was still a good film, they'd be like, whatever. Yeah, it's not cool, but it's actually kind of a fun movie. The fact that it's not a good movie makes these people just so pissed off that they made this. I'm probably in this group, obviously. But here's what's going to happen. The general audience loves it. 88% verified audience score, 67,000 verified ratings on Rotten Tomatoes. That's insanely high, and that really high number, but that's gone down from the 90s. What's going to happen is this. There's going to be a fallout. The general audience doesn't give a shit about wider context. They just don't care. They care about showing up, paying money, and being entertained. But there will be fallout from this movie. And you're going to see it in the critical perspective. You're going to see it in sort of the film nerd, film snob, Letterboxd perspective. Because it's not a good movie, and because it's a cash grab, because it's very, very sort of a corporate sort of ploy to sort of, drain the sponge of nostalgia, or whatever you want to call it, the general audience will stop showing up to some of this stuff eventually. Now, there's always going to be your Disney cultists, Trump's always going to have a 30 to 40% approval rating because there's a lot of cult people in this country. It's the same thing with Disney. They're just not going to go away. But the general audiences are going to shift because it was a big mistake. It wasn't a mistake to make the movie. I think you can make the movie and make it really, really good. It was a mistake to do it in the way that they did it. And I do think it's going to shift Disney's strategy a little bit. They're in like the salad days right now. They are making so much money. Toy Story 4 is a huge win. Aladdin's a huge win. Surprisingly, a huge global win too. Lion King's obviously printing money. And they're going to go right into Disney Plus here in November. I believe November 12th it launches. It's going to be a banner year for them. The problem is that, and they also have, I forgot, MCU, the biggest movie of all time. So they have all this stuff going for them. I do wonder though, Disney live action stuff going forward, how's, Mulan going to do? How is Little Mermaid going to do? I think we're going to see diminishing returns from that. And I think the general audiences this is the turning point on it. They went to go see it. They said they liked it. They're not going to like it in a year. And they're not going to go back to it in a year. I can guarantee you that right now. Because it's not good. It's objectively not a good film. And so, despite the fact that people went to go see it, they get caught up in the experience of going to the theater. They get caught up in their nostalgia and their remembering of the original, and they're with their family, with their friends, and everybody's super hyped, blah, blah, blah. 2-3 years from now, that score is going to keep dropping and dropping and dropping because it's just not a good film. So this is one of those situations where it's like, financially, it's a grand slam. But from a broader perspective, and think of it in terms of brand building, now is Disney just basically copying their old really good movies and shoving them down people's throats? How long is that going to last? How long is that going to work? That's exactly what they didn't do with MCU and why it was so successful. It felt new. It felt fresh. Every movie kind of had a different take on where the broader story was going. This isn't that. This is a direct copy of a copy. And so, yeah, I kind of wonder where the live action remake stuff is going to go for Disney right now, because this is not a good turn for it at all, despite financially doing fantastic. But they could have released nothing and called it Lion King that still made $1.5 million worldwide. Like, it was a given that it would make a ton of money, but it wasn't a given that it'd be a bad movie. And that's the surprising part to me. It's surprising to me that in the MCU world, they can make, $3 billion or what, or something crazy, like essentially what Endgame made $3 billion, but keep the quality of the movies always high. You never see an MCU movie and think that wasn't a good movie. Like, they're all like really good sort of standard fare blockbusters, but they're well done. When you have something like Lion King like this and it's just not really good and useful and interesting, that's an entirely different story. So I don't know. That's I got to stop my rant because we have so much to talk about. But just sort of, view the Lion King success in a broader context, because I think it might have some negative fallout to the whole Disney live action remake stuff. Or it could be totally wrong, like I was about comic book movies. Let's keep going. Number 4 this week, Dora the Explorer, Dora and the Lost City, new wide release opener, $17 million. Per theater average, $4,500. Let's look at this one a little bit closer. Rotten Tomato, 81%, 65 out of 100. So critics liked it, but just like Scary Stories, didn't love it. Verified audience is really high, 88%, 88 out of 100. All audience score, 85%, 85 out of 100. Audiences like it. Cinema score of an A-, I believe, or an A. I gotta double check that one. Post-track, 90% on post-track from parents, 70% from kids under 12. How do you measure, how do you get a kid under 12's perspective on a movie? I was thinking about this as I was reading that number. I was like, do kids even understand surveys like under 12? Do they really understand like 1 star versus 5 stars? I don't know, whatever. But parents really liked it a lot because I think Dora was like a kind of like a little kid in the TV show, but in this one, she's like a teenager. It was very strange. I don't really get the transition there, like why they wouldn't just cast a kid and make it a really kids movie instead of make her a teenager. Letterboxd score 60 out of 100. Toy Story was 80. Lion King was 60. Like I said, Aladdin 66. So it's not like a Toy Story level. It's not going to have a phenomenal multiplier. It is a kids movie. Does have a built-in audience. So it might be a little bit front-loaded. But with the kids stuff, they're also all going back to school like now. So what a weird time to release this movie. Like this seems more like a June-ish release or a May release. I would have bumped it up into this seems like a March release would be really good for this. Like maybe even like Easter weekend, wherever the holiday is. Might be better for that. Now it just makes no sense because you got like one, maybe 2 weekends of runway, and that's going to drop off the face of the earth, especially weekday numbers. So very bizarre release date for this. Performance wise, 17 million's okay. It was in a lot more theaters than Scary Stories. 600 more theaters, so its per theater average was $2,100 less per theater. That's pretty low. Production budget on this was 49 million. I guess it was filmed out in Australia because they got some Australian tax credits on that. Interesting with the audience, though, 44% was Latino, Latina. That's super high. That's like double what it normally is. Normally, audience is maybe 20 to 23% Latino. Here it was 44%, 39% white. That's lower, coming down from like a 53% of the average audience. 7% Asians, normal. 4% African American. That's pretty sort of depressed from a normal audience of like 12% African American. Females here were 57%, males were 43%. That makes sense. Way over indexed on the females. Under 25 was 55%, over 25 was 45%. Again, way over indexed on the young folks. But females under 25 with 31% of the audience total, so that makes sense. That's kind of like, that all kind of lines up with expectations. Huge Latina audience, focusing more on the under 25 females. But I think overall it's an okay performance, but something happened here with Paramount where they dumped it here in sort of the gutter slot of the summer, right? Like, why are they dumping it now? And I think, I don't know. I don't know anything about the sort of backstory of Dora the Explorer. I was much too old to ever sort of like see it as a kid. It's been around for like 20 years or something. I guess I was a teenager when it came out. So I don't know much about it. I don't know how it plays to that audience or plays to that sort of narrative that's been built up over those 20 years. It was a Nickelodeon show. But it just seems kind of $17 million just doesn't seem great for something like this. If you have that built-in audience, you want something like this to at least hit 25, right? And then what you really want to happen is for it to hit 25, have a 3x multiplier in domestic US, Canada, hit $75 million domestically, and then you got a franchise that you can build off of and start doing different films and then expand out into streaming and all that kind of other stuff. I think Paramount buried it. That's what it kind of feels like to me. Throwing it down in this August slot. The movie looks pretty good. Like, it's not terrible. So you kind of got to wonder what the thought process and why they buried it was. But I think that's what happened here. Okay, so that's Dora the Explorer, Dora and the Lost City of Gold. Number 5 was Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, 11.6 in its third weekend. 42% drop, sits just past $100 million, or will today. Very good performance for this movie. Cost a lot, cost way too much to market to. Has not opened anywhere else, I don't think, besides the US and Canada. There's a little bit of a foreign open here. Where did it open? I didn't even see this. Opened in Hong Kong. And that's it, I guess. I don't know, maybe the UK or something. It doesn't tell me here. But so mostly US, Canada released right now at 100 million. Expectation maybe worldwide 200 million, 250-ish. Which now that I'm thinking that, it's really strong for a movie like that. But I don't know if the foreign market's going to be that robust for it. I do feel like it's very much a US film that may not play as well at all outside this country. So, but outside the context of its cost, it's a really big win for Quentin Tarantino and Sony. With the cost in mind, it's an unknown quantity. Could break even, could lose money, maybe could make a profit, but the costs are very high for it to do that. Number 6 this weekend was The Art of Racing in the Rain, another new wide release, 8.1 million. Not good at all. Sub 3,000, $2,929 per theater average. I don't know what happened here. This one's a tough one to get a read on too. Come on, it's a dog movie. Who doesn't want to see a dog movie? But like we're seeing with the other films, Scary Stories and Dora, they got dumped. They're getting dumped in August because the studio didn't believe in it and they didn't know if it was going to do well. So they say, where are we going to put this thing? Well, we got the last 3 weeks of August for, it's kind of an experimental. It's kind of exciting because it's kind of this proving ground of whether this film's actually going to be good and do well. And we see it take off. Like The Meg was like that. They dumped that in August. The biggest example was Crazy Rich Asians, which they put out in August. And because they probably didn't know like who's going to see this, where's the audience, how are we going to get people who, you know, aren't Asian American to go see this movie? And it worked. And it was one of those movies that maybe the studio didn't have a ton of faith in, because if they did, they wouldn't release it in August. They released it in like, I don't know, October or November. And they didn't. And every once in a while it works. Dora's not really working. Art of Race in the Rain certainly did not work. 48% Rotten Tomatoes score from critics, 50 out of 100. Ouch. But here's where it gets crazy. Verified audience score at 96%. With an actual score of 93 out of 100. That's insanely high. All audience score very similar, 93%, 91 out of 100. Cinema score of an A-, post track of a 90. Definite recommend of a 72. So here's the deal on this. Critics, of course, hate it. Letterboxd gives it a 64 versus 60 Dog's Journey, 62 for A Dog's Purpose, 62 for Marley and Me, Homeward Bound, The Incredible Journey, one of my favorite movies from the 90s, 62. So it's right in line with our dog movies in terms of what sort of the film community thinks about it. But it doesn't matter. Critics don't like it that much. Film community is like, meh. The general audience loves this movie. I think my parents saw it and they liked it. It's just one of those films that's meant for people who love dogs and want to cry. And then you want to go to the theater and cry with strangers about dogs. That's what this movie's for. And so apparently people have really enjoyed that and they got what they wanted out of it. So it's not a good performance though financially. It's going to have, I think, a longer life on digital, streaming, and otherwise, home entertainment. But it's kind of essentially DOA at the box office. $20 million to produce this thing, which makes kind of sense. It's not super high, not super low. It's certainly not a micro budget film, but it's not even really a mid budget film either. Mid budget would be like 40 to 50, so it's like half of that. So they didn't really put too much on the table for this, and I think they're gonna walk away with some cash. It seems like, especially when you bring in TV deals and stuff like that. Over 45 was 24% of the audience. Females over 25 was the biggest quadrant at 34%. Played best on the East Coast and Midwest. Okay, so that's kind of not a great performance, kind of a swing and a miss on that one, but expected for this time period in August. Another pretty big miss here is The Kitchen from Warner Brothers New Line. Melissa McCarthy and Tiffany Haddish. They play the leads here. This one was in the can, I think, last summer, ever since last July. So over about a year now. Same thing that happened with Happy Time Murders. So they keep stuff in the can. It's finished. They don't know what to do with it. They don't know if it's good. Where do we put this out? Let's throw it out in August. It's kind of like January in that respect. Lowest wide release opening ever for Melissa McCarthy and Tiffany Haddish. Rotten Tomatoes score 20%. Ouch. 45 actual score, which is almost worse than that. Verified audience 67%, not good. 75 out of 100 real score. All audience score 62% Rotten Tomatoes, 69 out of 100. Cinema score of a B-, Letterboxd score of a 52. Nobody likes this movie. Critics absolutely hate it. Audiences are not responding well to it. It got dumped, and this is why they put it out in August. That's essentially half these movies is that's what's happening here. Same thing with Brian Banks. Where did that come in at? Did it hit top 10? It did it. No, it didn't hit top 10. I thought it did. So Brian Banks, 2.1 million, 1,200 theaters. This is from Bleecker Street. $1,700 per theater on your opening weekend. I don't know what happened. Did they even market this thing? I saw like one or two ads for it. 54% from critics, 58 actual score. Rotten Tomatoes, not good. Verified audience score at 98%. All audience score 96%. No cinema score wasn't big enough, so they didn't do it. No post track, I don't think either. Or maybe it was like a 90%. I didn't see that. So one of those weird movies where it's like nobody shows up for it, but the people who do love it. I don't know. I don't know how to explain that. This is not a super wide release. Dumped in this time period for whatever reason. And it just didn't. No one's gonna see this outside of the people who saw it, essentially, and that's not a large group of people. And like, it'll have a life on Netflix or whatever a little bit, but even still, I don't see the purpose of doing a film like this, because it costs millions of dollars to make. They probably dumped a few $1 million, 10 something, into P&A and advertising. It just kind of blows my mind that this seems like a TV movie, and why would you put it out in theaters? I don't understand that strategy, because it's never going to be successful in a theater. That was 12. I skipped the rest of the top 10. 8, Spider-Man Far From Home, 5.3 million, 33% drop. I mean, come on, folks. These movies, like the Spider-Man movies, just do not go away. $370 million. That's insane. Toy Story 4, 4.4 million, good 40% drop. That now sits at $419 million. That's a good win for Disney. Not like they needed one. Bring the Soul, the movie from Trafalgar. I have no idea what this is. Did what here? Let's see how this thing actually did. It's top 10, so 2.3 million. 873 theaters. Per theater average $2,600. It's made $4.4 million so far. I have no clue what this is. I don't even know who Trafalgar is. It's a documentary. Okay. Oh, is that like a? Oh, okay. I was like, it had to be. Is this like Korean? Bring the Soul. Yeah, it's like it's a K-pop documentary. That's why I was so sort of bewildered by that whole thing. That's pretty good for that. That's not going to go anywhere, of course. Okay, so that's the top 10. What are the pullaways? Look, it's a tough time of year. They're throwing everything out there. Nothing really is a winner besides Scary Stories. I don't think Dora is a winner for the cost and what they wanted to get out of it. Art of Racing in the Rain and The Kitchen are definitely losses. Brian Banks, I'm not sure what they were thinking with that. Also a loss. Let's talk a little bit about limited stuff, and we'll sort of see what's coming out in the next few weeks here. Okay, so Aladdin, by the way, is still around. $352 million in the 14th place. Crawl, what else? What's going to lose the most theaters this weekend? Crawl looks like it's going to. 1,900 theaters it lost this weekend. So that's on its way out. Probably will get capped off at about $39 million. Not a great run for a movie like that. Should have been much higher. Should have been way, way higher than that. A couple of limited releases. The Peanut Butter Falcon. Keep your eye on this one. So opened up in 17 theaters, $12K per theater, which is not great. Not super great. Big release in Salt Lake City. I don't know why. LA, Los Angeles. I think it's doing very well. Deadline says there's a private cinema score going around of an A+. That sounds like bullshit from a PR agency who's putting this out. That sounds like BS from Roadside Distractions. But whatever. It's out in the air now. So keep your eye on this one. Shia LaBeouf. He's a crazy dude, but he does some really interesting projects. He does, a lot of art stuff now. This seems a little bit more on the arty side of things, so I don't know if it can do a big breakout. But I do think they're going to do a slow release for the next 3 weeks, which I think is very smart for a film like this. But it kind of remains to be seen if this thing does have any legs outside the art house sort of scene. It might. After the Wedding was a limited release this weekend, $57K, $11K per theater in 5 theaters, New York, Los Angeles, obviously. That's not going to break out. There's a couple other limited releases. David Crosby's documentary is doing okay. The Nightingale, I didn't talk about that one last week. A lot of buzz with that one, doing terribly. It's not really going to break out at all. Echo in the Canyon's a documentary, didn't really break out at all either. Not a ton going on limited outside Peanut Butter Falcon, doing pretty well. Okay, so let's transition over to our new segment. We're gonna have Chris take it away with the Time Machine, which is I'm really excited for. So definitely stay tuned to this, and I'll come close out the show afterwards.
Hey there, and welcome to the first ever Wildline Time Machine. My name is Chris, and I will be your sub-host for this segment. Thanks to Dan for having me on here. I've been friends with Dan for years, dating all the way back to the late 90s, early 2000s, when he was just that guy with the alternating Independence Day and Oasis t-shirts in the hallways of our old high school. It was kind of kismet that eventually we would become friends like we are today and have been for quite time now. And I teach film studies at the high school level and have just been an equally aggressive, opinionated nerd on the topic for many years. So I am happy to be here and help him not just look at the box office today, but specifically what I'll be doing here on the Wildline Time Machine is looking back into the past and prognosticating a little bit in the future. I've got 3 movies I'd like to talk to you about that came out about 25 years ago to the day. 1994 we'll be looking at today. Around this weekend, the August 12th weekend of 1994 to be exact. And then we'll also look at 3 movies that are coming out in the next year or so that have begun filming, made past the arduous pre-production stage, are legit going to happen, and make a little estimate about what might happen when they finally do come across boxofficemojo.com. All right, so starting first with 1994, going back into the past, I wanted to talk a little bit about a movie that somehow held the top spot 2 weeks in a row, Clear and Present Danger, a movie that I absolutely, and I hope Dan would agree with me, would say could never even get close to the kind of box office prowess that it did back in 94. Yes, Harrison Ford is a huge star still today, but I don't think that would be enough. The Jack Ryan Amazon series, of which that character came from, the Clear and Present Dangers and the Hunt for Red Octobers of the halcyon days of the 1990s, but I do not think there's much more than that. There's like the Jack Reacher segment, and maybe if they made Jack Ryan a little less middle-agey or middle-agey with muscles like they have with Tom Cruise and Jack Reacher, you could do that. But no, this movie made 122 at the box office. That's unadjusted, folks, and that is just absolutely insane to think that it could do such damage, especially in the wake of a couple other huge movies that were coming out right then. It's the 90s, so things were different. You could stay in the top 3 pretty easily. And in its 5th weekend of release, Forrest Gump was the number 2 movie of August 12th, 1994 box office receipts. And of course, that film would go on to not only win Best Picture, but also a domestic gross of $330 million. Also kind of strange. Top 2 films, not really big blockbuster and no franchising whatsoever, unless you count the Jack Ryan, even though, Patriot Games was barely a blip on the radar as far as like calling it a long-term franchise. It was just, just as successful enough to merit a follow-up, though, still very much standing on its own, not serialized, very episodic, like franchises tended to be in the 90s, unless they were something huge like, the Star Wars prequels or something. But that was number 2, and then finally number 3, you see something that it makes a little more sense, and it's The Mask, a movie that was in its 3rd week of release and dropped down to number 3. But thinking back about that, of the 3 movies that you can think of as being, emblematic of 94, the one that I would not say is emblematic, Clear and Present Danger, managed to rise above both Forrest Gump and The Mask in those waning days of summer. Domestic final gross on The Mask, under the number for Clear and Present Danger, it actually only made 119, which is still huge, of course. It was a iconic film from the start, but it was not nearly as much of a powerhouse as maybe I would have anticipated looking back at these receipts. There's your little look at the past. Of course, Jim Carrey was at the height of his game there. This is after Ace Ventura and after, not quite at the moment of Dumb and Dumber, so it's like he's still on the rise, but that's a pretty great result for a movie that has stood the test of time. Not so much, but definitely kind of become a flashpoint for 90s humor, so to speak. Let's take a look at the forecast for the box office in 2020, shall we? One movie that's kind of taken up a lot of press in terms of in-production news is this movie that has, as of yet, does not have an official title, but it's being referred to as the Eurovision movie, revolving around the hugely popular, long-running TV music competition, the Eurovision Song Contest. And probably the biggest piece of weirdness from this, seemingly, standard behind-the-scenes, backstage musical type thing is that it's going to be starring Will Ferrell. And that's not exactly the kind of thing you'd imagine for a Will Ferrell movie, unless, of course, they kind of make it absurd, make it kind of like a cross between a modern-day Adam McKay movie with like an old-school Adam McKay movie. But it's actually not even going to be involving Adam McKay at all. It'll be, involving probably his, second cousin in Hollywood speak, David Dobkin, who is probably most known for Wedding Crashers and had a couple minor hits with Fred Claus and Shanghai Nights, the Shanghai Noon sequel. But this is a guy that really has not had much happen for him in the past decade or so, really. Fred Claus came out in 2007. Since then, we had The Change Up in 2011, which I think a lot of people thought was going to be a bigger hit than it actually was. It only made 37. That's the Freaky Friday big style movie with Jason Bateman and Ryan Reynolds. And it left I think kind of a sour taste in people's mouth because Dobkin really wasn't up to bat for anything huge in the rest of this decade. He did kind of quietly put out a movie called The Judge with Robert Downey Jr., which I don't recall very well, though there's a blip in my memory about just kind of this very straightforward drama with like lightly comic bits from Robert Downey Jr. Robert Duvall's also in it, Billy Bob Thornton, Vincent D'Onofrio. It's a crazy cast. But once again, that didn't make a lot of money either. 47 for a total domestic take on that one. So I don't know how Dobkin's going to hit this one out of the park, especially because Will Ferrell hasn't really had a hit in a while. Holmes and Watson was obviously a huge flop last year in 2018. Before that in 2017, Daddy's Home 2, yes, but that was also, on the strength of the co-stars. The House was also a flop, 25 mil. Zoolander 2, major flop, 28. The original Daddy's Home, 150. And then basically, aside from the Daddy's Home movies, this guy, Will Ferrell, like a legend in comedy, has not had a hit since Get Hard back in 2015 with 90 mil. And even though that's not a hugely, it's not over 100 at all. Anchorman 2 was 127, and people were still talking about how that was kind of a flop because it's Anchorman, and you expected something huger from that. So I would say like the first like really big hit, if you're not counting Anchorman 2, is Megamind back in 2010, because he had that string of indie movies, Everything Must Go and The Campaign. Well, The Campaign's not really an indie movie. That was also not quite a hit. The Zach Galifianakis political comedy with 86 mil. So I don't know. Will Ferrell seems to be not as reliable as one would hope or imagine nowadays. So, I mean, he also had a bit part in Lego Movie 2, but once again, Dan talked about a lot earlier this year why that was considered kind of not the slam dunk that a lot of people thought it would be. So I'm not sure about this Eurovision movie. If I had to take a random guess, I could see this, if they really lean into the comedy end of this like backstage musical, real life kind of thing, and just like make it super absurd, it could be like a surprise hit. A la, I don't know, Napoleon Dynamite or Blades of Glory. But if they try to go a little more serious, like a dramedy style thing, because it's also got Rachel McAdams in it and Pierce Brosnan, and I don't know if those are the strongest comedic leads. I know Pierce has got it in him. I don't know if Rachel does. I don't know. I do not see this film breaking out huge. Maybe an 86 around the likes of The Campaign, but nothing really bigger than that. Another one coming up soon that a lot of people are talking about is the Saw reboot done by comedian actor Chris Rock. There's a lot of split opinions on how this could work. There's some people that are saying like, yeah, with the right people, of course Saw could work. Can't say I'm one of those people. I don't mind Chris Rock. I actually kind of liked his whatever that top 5 movie was a few years ago. It didn't totally stick with me, but I remember being kind of enamored with the poignancy of it, combined with kind of the laugh out loud thing that used to with Chris Rock. Samuel L. Jackson being involved is also a good sign. He seems to be reliable, though he did have a huge flop with the new Shaft. So it's kind of unsure. The director for this one is Darren Lynn Bousman, who has not done a lot besides Saw 2 and Saw 4. He did Rebuild the Genetic Opera. He did the movie 11-11-11, which never really broke. I don't even know if that was theatrically released. So I don't know. I mean, they're kind of going back to the well, but also trying something new, with old kind of standbys that maybe don't have it in them to do something very bold. So I'm bullish on that one, to say the least. Last one I want to talk with you about that is just kind of the obvious pick for my inaugural Wildline Time Machine is this Black Widow movie coming out in May of 2020. It feels like whenever you talk about this, it always depends on what gaffe ScarJo has done in an interview lately. And clearly the one that's still fresh in a lot of people's head, even though it's a few weeks old now, is where she said that she should be able to play anybody, whether it be a different race or a different gender or a tree. And that was just obviously a clumsy mouthful of privilege that just we hope never would have been uttered. I will say I do think that Black Widow was unfairly kind of cast aside in Endgame, and regardless of your feelings about ScarJo, I do think that that's gonna kind of make it harder for them to kind of build excitement over this origin story, which is basically the only thing you can do when you have what happened in Endgame happen to one of the main Avengers who had been there since Iron Man 2, one of the earlier Marvel films. So who's to say? Is it going to be as big as Captain Marvel? I can't imagine it's going to be even close. Is it going to be as big as Wonder Woman? I don't think it's going to even be close to that either. And yes, just to be clear, the final consensus, it seems, and obviously Endgame hype was a part of this, but Captain Marvel did end up eking out Wonder Woman in the box office, so it officially is the highest grossing female-led comic book film. Some things that are a good sign for Black Widow, though, is the supporting cast. You got Ray Winstone, Florence Pugh from Midsommar, Rachel Weisz, David Harbour from Stranger Things. It seems like this is... Marvel knows what they're doing. They know how to turn things around. If they can keep ScarJo quiet on the interview circuit for a while, then perhaps some good things will happen. I do think she's a smart woman. I think that she will hopefully have some interesting things to say about this role, especially with the inclination or I guess it depends on how bold they are with their subtext, since this is a Russian character. But Marvel's not necessarily one to get political, so I can't imagine it's going to do anything vastly subversive, but it will be interesting to see if they can, do a couple things to make it at least stand out, kind of like Captain Marvel did with its, subtle jabs of feminism as far as you could get out of a comic book movie. The director for this one is Kate Shortland. Does not have a lot of credits to her name besides the Berlin Syndrome film from 2017, which did technically have a release, but it is an Australian film and is mostly known as kind of just her getting her name out there. Did not have much of a run at the American box office, though it did seem like it was relatively successful in its native Australia. What does that mean for Black Widow? Not much. Marvel's the kind of studio that can kind of make any director work. It does help when it's somebody that has some kind of cult status like Taika Waititi. Not going to happen with this one. It'll probably be kind of pretty pastel-y and muted, but I think it'll do well enough to be another Marvel hit, just not quite as big of a hit as Captain Marvel, probably not even as big of a hit as Wonder Woman. That's it for this edition of the Wildline Time Machine. Thanks again, Dan, for letting me have my 15 minutes on your show. Make sure to stick around for what Dan has in store, and I'll try my best to be back soon. If not next week, definitely the week after, here on the Wildline Podcast.
How awesome was that? What a great segment from Chris. I love talking about the old box office stuff from the 90s, just because that's when I came of age with movies in terms of like being obsessed with the business side of things and the numbers. And he also called out my Independence Day shirt obsession. I wore that Independence Day shirt from like the moment the movie came out, which was what, 96? So I guess it was in 8th grade or something. For a good year. I just like wore like every other day, that and Oasis. And I got beat up and made fun of constantly for both. More the Oasis thing than Independence Day. But that was awesome to hear about what was going on 25 years ago at the box office. And then also what's coming up here. You know, the Eurovision movie is really interesting because, and I think Chris brings up a great point about Will Ferrell. His sort of status is so much bigger culturally than his financial strength at the box office, right? He's just not that strong of a star to get people to show up. And that wasn't the case 15 years ago. Like I'm thinking back to like the mid 2000s, where he was popping up in everything, you know, from Old School, Ricky Bobby, like all that stuff. He was just crushing. And like, he just doesn't, he made that weird switch. Everything Must Go, Stranger Than Fiction. And he just never, I don't know, he never came around to being an A-list star that could carry a film like a Dwayne Johnson could. And also because comedy has essentially had a slow, painful death at the box office over the last 5-6 years. I think that's one of the reasons. His last movie was the Sherlock Holmes movie is basically unwatchable. Even like the most lowbrow fan of comedy says that movie's terrible. And you got problems when like the general masses rejects a movie so forcefully like that. But Eurovision, I think, is going to be the similar situation. Although I will say I am a little bit upset about Chris questioning Rachel McAdams' comedic acting ability. Rachel McAdams is wonderful in every possible way. Almost a bannable offense on this podcast by attacking her acting ability. But that's okay. I'll let it pass this time. One warning on there. Pierce Brosnan, great comedic actor. It sounds like a ridiculous concept. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but you never know. Like, what the hell is that stupid figure skating movie that he was in? Blades of Glory? That was so dumb, but it worked and it did all right. So maybe it's one of those situations where it's stupid enough where people are going to show up and just laugh it off. Laugh off the terribleness of this world right now. Okay, so that was an awesome segment. I hope Chris comes back and does it again next weekend. Let's close out the show here and talk about what's happening over the next couple of weeks at the box office. Ingrid Birds 2 opens up on Wednesday. I don't think it's going to do okay. Then we have 4 new wide releases. 47 Meters Down, Uncaged, Blinded by the Light, Good Boys, Where'd You Go, Bernadette. 47 Meters Down is a sequel to the original, which was a VOD movie that they liked so much and decided to release theatrically and then went on to make like $40 million. One of the weirder stories of the last few years of the box office. So it's pretty cool to see this trailer or this sequel come out. What's it going to do? I don't know. I mean, I have no clue. It's such a weird time to release these movies. Maybe 15. I think it's going to do okay. I don't think they poured any money into it. But it's just bizarre that this thing's coming out. I would say like 15 closes out like 35-ish, 40-ish. So it could do okay, actually. I'm thinking about those numbers now. Blinded by the Light just feels too close to yesterday. Coming of age story about a dude who's really into a specific band. I mean, come on. Like, not that they're like, where else are you going to put this release? But like this gutter slot in the doldrums of August, it's not going to do anything. This is a movie that needs a super limited release. It does have that crossover ability like Yesterday does too, to the masses. Like my 80-year-old aunt would go see that. She saw Yesterday and loved it. Blinded by the Light, I think it has the same capability, but number one, it's second in line. So people have already been there, done that with this. 2, this release date's wrong. Like this is a late September, early October release date, and I don't know why they're pushing it out now because I guess they don't think it's going to make any money. Good Boys looks like a disaster. It looks like Problem Child 30. If you remember that series from the 90s. I don't know. Seth Rogen's involved. One of the worst trailers I've seen in a very long time. I have no interest to see this. I mean, maybe it is targeted at like boys from like 10 to 20 or something, but they're all going to be going back to school. Why would you release it now? That's going to flop. Where'd You Go, Bernadette? United Artists releasing. That is actually Annapurna. If you were not following the news this week in Variety or Deadline or whatever, Annapurna is going bankrupt, literally. They can't find anybody to give them money. Larry Ellison obviously is a billionaire. His daughter runs the studio, Megan Ellison. Despite the fact that she has good taste with art, apparently she's not good at running a business. So they've lost, I think, $300 million is what they originally raised. And like I could do a whole show on how Annapurna's basically screwed everything up. But they are going out of business, possibly. But I'm sure Larry Ellison will step in and give her like $500 million. So I don't think they're going away. But they're releasing United Artists releasing. It's just, they're not doing anything. It's not good. Where'd You Go, Bernadette? It looks like an awesome movie. It looks like a movie that would open in like your downtown arty theater 10 years ago. Why are you pushing this wide? It makes zero sense. And honestly, now that I'm looking at it, it's almost like financially irresponsible to push this wide. You're pushing it out in 2,300 theaters for a movie that should be playing at like the ArcLight and Angelica in New York for like 2 weeks. See how it does. If it does well, then you expand it out. What are you trying to trick people to show up? You're trying to trick people to show up to a movie they've never heard of with stars they sort of know, with people in like a mall in San Antonio. It's not going to happen. No one's going to show up. It's going to have maybe a $1,500 per theater average, maybe $1,000, maybe under $1,000. It's going to have one of the worst wide release openings ever. I'm calling it right now. One of the worst weekends of the year with a movie that nobody has any idea about from a company that has no idea what they're doing. But that's that. 23rd, Angel Has Fallen, looks good. Might go see that. Brainless action movie with Gerard Butler. Sign me up. Geostorm, I'm in. I don't know how well it's going to do though. It's a tough weekend, the 23rd. Overcomer's also coming out. I don't know that one very well. Nothing really limited either. Ready or Not actually comes out a few days before that on 21st, Wednesday. I don't know, this one's weird. The similar movie. So there's two movies, The Most Dangerous Gamer inspired both these movies, Ready or Not and The Hunt. The Hunt just got canceled this week because of the El Paso shooting. And the marketing, showed people shooting each other and hunting each other. So they canceled the marketing, then they just canceled the entire movie. It was a Blumhouse movie, and Blumhouse has a distribution deal through Universal. So technically Universal canceled it. So it didn't cost much to make, maybe $5 million. But this one, Ready or Not, beat it by a month in release. But I think it's going to be kind of dead on arrival too, because it's the 21st of August. Who's going to go see a movie like this now? It looks really good from Fox Searchlight. I mean, Fox Searchlight has a really good sort of eye for smaller movies. It could have done better, I think, in October, but it's not going to do anything this week. It's not even a weekend movie. It's a Wednesday opening. It's going to fall flat on its face. And then you probably have the worst weekend of the year, which is the 30th. Nothing's really opening from a wide major studio. Absolutely nothing. One of the few weekends of the year, you're not going to have anything open up. And then we have It Chapter 2 on the 6th of September. It's going to be so slow the next couple of weeks. Next weekend, I'll probably do a normal show. Maybe. I got people coming into town, so I might miss that show. I might do it at night. But there's 4 new wide releases, so a lot to talk about. But like the 23rd and the 30th are going to be quiet, so I might do my summer review show and then autumn fall preview show. That should be a lot of fun. Any of that. Thanks for listening, guys. This has been the Wild Line Podcast.